you can start at any place. There's no such thing as something that's above your skill level if you're just willing to take the time.
Hello, I'm Tricia Waddell, Editor-in-Chief of Stitch Magazine, and I'm going to talk to you about how to sew on faux leather. There's a couple of basic techniques that you just need to keep in mind, and you'll be able to make some really fabulous things. So let's start over here and talk about cutting first. You're going to want to use a rotary cutter because that is going to really give you the cleanest cut on faux leather. And when you're thinking about using faux leather, you're going to want to think about, there's a lot of different weights that you can get. So this is sort of a medium weight, sort of more home dec weight. Up here, I have a couple different weights and finishes. You can see you can get all kinds of different textures, metallics. This is sort of a lighter weight one. So you're going to want to, kind of test, your techniques and your tension based on the weight of faux leather that you're using. When you're thinking about marking on faux leather, you're not going to want to use a tracing wheel if you're marking pattern lines. If you're marking on the front, like if you're marking any kind of notches, you're going to want to use a chalk wheel. And if you're marking on the back, tailor's chalk works really well for marking so that you're not getting any kind of marks through the faux leather. And you can see here that it has a knit backing, and so technically there's no grain in terms of cutting it out, but you are going to want to think about the stretch. So it is going to have a little bit of stretch from this knit backing, with most of the stretch being in the crosswise grain. So just kind of think about that when you're planning your projects. Now, in terms of seaming, again, you don't want any holes to happen in the faux leather, so you're not going to want to use pins. You're going to either want to use clips. Here we have these little quilt clips that you can use, and you just put them right inside the seam allowance, and then you can seam right along here. You could use binder clips or anything that's not going to put too much of an impression on the faux leather. You can also use basting tape. So this is something that you get in the fabric store. It's basically a double-sided tape that's set up for not leaving any kind of residue on your faux leather or any other material. So you definitely want to get it at the fabric store because you're going to pull this off as soon as you are done seaming. When you're seaming faux leather, because you're not doing any ironing, you're going to want to top stitch. And right here I'm using a non-stick foot, so that's going to help it feed really easily through here. You can also use a roller foot, and I'm also using a Microtex sharp needle, and that's going to minimize having large holes in your leather. So that's what you want to minimize. And you're also going to want to be sure to avoid back tacking if you can, so that you're not adding extra holes to your faux leather. So what you can do is leave long tails at the end and then just tie them off, sort of like what you do when you're sewing darts. Okay, so what we're doing here is now you're going to open this, and you can see how easy it is to pull it apart from your basting tape. And then what I'm going to want to do here, because this is a heavier weight faux leather, I'm going to want my seams to be open, and I'm going to want to top stitch those down on both sides. So here it would be, it's probably, you could, depending on how big a piece you're using, you could do you could use basting tape here, or you could use clips. I kind of just do a little bit of sort of finger pressing to hold my seams open. And as you sew along, it starts to close up your seam. And I'm using a contrasting thread here to make it easy for you to see what I'm doing, but typically you would be using a matching thread. So you can see how it's just going to hold your seam down nicely on both sides. And then if you're using a lighter weight faux leather like this, then you can actually do a fold over to one side. So you don't have to hold them open because it's not going to be as bulky. So here it's just top stitch with both of the seam allowances flipped to one side. If you want to get a little more decorative, you can use a zigzag stitch and fold it to one side as well. Another thing that you can do to create some pretty decorative seams is use a twin needle. And that's what I've done here on this wrap belt, is just used a twin needle to top stitch my seams. Here I used it twice to top stitch. You just have to pay attention when you're pivoting at the corners and go slowly, but it's a nice, it adds a nice feature for the stitching on the top of that. Now, if you're using a backing fabric, you do want to think about the weight of that. So this is the backing fabric that I actually used on the back of the belt. And this is a tapestry home dec weight fabric, because you're not going to want to use something that's too light when you're folding back the seams. And you're going to be, just using regular thread here. If you're doing twin needle, obviously you're going to need 2 spools of thread. But you're not using any kind of special thread. You're just going to want to make sure you have the right needle and the right foot, so it makes it really easy to feed. And a good tip is if you're having trouble with it feeding and you don't have a special foot, you can use a regular foot and try doing tissue stitch seams, putting tissue paper in between the foot and the faux leather, and that'll help give you some traction. You can also play with putting masking tape on the bottom of your foot, and that'll help give you some traction. Or you can also dust with cornstarch or talcum powder, anything that'll kind of give you some traction, because what it's going to want to do, it's going to want to stick, and that will help you move more smoothly across the leather while you're sewing. Now, what's great about it is that you don't have any kind of fringing or raveling that happens with it. So you can cut it straight, and you can leave the edges raw if you like. But a nice finish, if you're not doing a lining or you're not doing a backing fabric, is to add some kind of decorative ribbon or binding to finish the edge. So what I have here is just, I have a wide ribbon here, and all I've done is attach it here at the bottom. And, I'm just using it to fold. I'm folding it halfway around and doing a top stitch here, okay? And then flipping it over. And you can, depending on how easy this is for you and how wide your ribbon is, you could pin this, I would use basting tape to attach this, and you can sew both sides down at the same time. If it's a little trickier, you might want to stitch one side and stitch the other side. And then you have a nice edge to fold up. And if you are using fabric, you could also use your own seam binding here instead of a ribbon if you want to match it to whatever you're making. You just want to make sure you're folding the wrong sides together when you come over here, and then you can fold it up, because what you want to do is reduce any kind of seam or hem bulk wherever you can. So you don't want to do a double fold here. So this gives you a way to just do one fold, and then you have a nice edge here. And then on the other side, say this was the bottom of a skirt, you would just top stitch across here, and then it looks as nice on the back as it does on the front. And those are tips for successfully working with faux leather.